to presentations from Spencer and Amy about their studies of forces and activities that are part of the culture of the church. We are grateful for the breadth and reach of the gospel and the way it illuminates the rounds and corners of our lives. We pray that we may enjoy listening and thinking about the presentation we're about to hear. We pray that we will find a use for the things that we learn and think about, and we do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that very much. Tonight, I'm just delighted to welcome Spencer and Amy here with us tonight. They're wonderful individuals who have got distinguished careers and I think have something to tell us tonight. So the question I asked in the invitation was, what do you know about DezNat, the DezNat hashtag on Twitter? And I'm frank to tell you that I knew absolutely nothing about it and had my attention brought to it a little bit more recently, which I'll just mention just in a minute. But the hashtag has been described by its defenders as for, quote, for standing up and speaking for Christ on Twitter. And it's in response to perceived criticisms, I guess, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by its own members. However, at the same time as Spencer and Amy have tutored me here a little bit, the fact of the matter is that the hashtag has become very controversial, and the question is whether these people have really gone over the line and have become sort of the alt-right designatees in terms of what's wrong and what's right with those who question or talk about the church. So I think they have some very interesting things to tell us about it. They specifically studied the April 2019 General Conference, and I think we're going to tell us a little bit about the results of that. Let me tell you first of all about Spencer. He is a PhD, a professor of information communication technology at the School of Information Science, the University of Kentucky. His professional training is in education. He has a BA in French teaching and a 2008 PhD in educational psychology and educational technology. But his career has been really interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. He uses data from social media and websites to study how participants in those online spaces make meaning and form social groups. He's published in Social Media and Society, Journal of Homosexuality, Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, and the Journal of Research on Technology and Education. Delighted to have Amy with him as well. They've worked together on this project, my understanding. Amy is a doctorate from Michigan State University and is currently the Director of Operations for the New Jersey Psychological Association. And this role has in prior administrative roles in nonprofit corporations and organizations. She manages NJPA's events, continuing education offerings, and its charitable foundation. She's also a researcher using qualitative approaches to understand how people define, develop, and change communities. Amy has published widely on how social media can be used within educational contexts and how spirituality impacts school culture and wellness. She's a former public and private school teacher, and she holds 3 degrees from Boston College and a doctorate in educational psychology and educational technology from Michigan State University. Her first book, Social Media for Civic Education, Engaging Youth for Democracy, was published in October 2022. She is an editor of Supporting Children and Youth Through Spiritual Education, published in 2023. So Spencer and Amy, we're delighted to have you here with us tonight and are happy to turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you. Amy, I'm going to get our slides up and then I'll let you make the good first impression for us.
Well, I'll do my best. Thanks for running the slides. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for inviting us to talk with you, to hear a little bit about our work, our research. It's always funny. I'm always struck when someone else reads my bio. We're trained to, speak about ourselves and our accomplishments and all of that fancy stuff. I'm a teacher and a minister, and that's usually how I orient myself to the world. So that's how I'm going to orient myself to all of you. I'm on the East Coast, so it's 10 o'clock my time. So at best, that's what I could do anyway. So I'm Amy Chapman. My partner and co-conspirator in this work is Spencer Greenhaugh. If I were laying blame, I would say he got me into this, but really it's been a fair shake, and our bios did more than I could in reintroducing ourselves. So that's us. During our talk, we want you to feel free to engage with us electronically in the chat, and afterwards, with email or social media, we'd love to stay in dialogue with you. So as Ross mentioned, we're going to talk about a portion of our work that focuses on the online community known as DezNat, which is a hashtag community on the social media platform that now is known as X, but it used to be known as Twitter. And when we collected our data, that was the name that it went by. The Des part of that is a reference to the 19th century territory of Deseret. And while users of the hashtag have said that DezNat, right, what's on the screen, is an abbreviation of Deseret Nation, its recurring use of alt-right discourses show that DezNat could also be short for Deseret Nationalism. So DezNat states that its goal of that movement is to support and affirm the authority of the LDS Church, particularly in response to progressive Mormons who are comfortable questioning its leadership or teachings. There's lots of really interesting things that we could dive into in the data that we have about this kind of loose community that is known as DezNat. And I'm so sorry if you can hear my dog. I just got home from a different work event, and so my dog has chosen this moment to sit next to me and chew her bone as opposed to any other option. So if that gets too distracting or ridiculous, I'll try to scoot her out or get her a quieter toy. I'm sorry.
You're coming in loud and clear, Amy, not a problem.
Okay, thank you. She's a good buddy. Anyway, so there's lots of interesting things that we could talk about with DezNat, but tonight we wanted to particularly talk about how users of the hashtag seem to understand and appropriate religious authority. So we have 3 slides that we want to show you that are images of tweets. At the risk of really being very basic, a tweet is a post on this social media platform that used to be called Twitter, now called X. This one and the 2 others combine images and text in ways that provide additional understanding beyond what's just on the screen. So we're going to show you just 3 of these and ask if you want to put in the chat any reactions that you may have to them. They're loaded images. A lot may come up for you. And it may be that these are the kind of images we've spent years with these. So initial reactions may vary. And if you don't want to do that, it's late at night my time, it's late at night your time. That's okay. So this first meme, right, an image that can include text that is altered and which communicates something beyond the image and the literal text in a way that makes you kind of think things further than what's on the screen. We see Brigham Young depicted as in the style of Groyper, which is a frog associated with the far right. Also in this meme, despite the presence of Joseph Smith Jr., it's Young whose image has been altered to meld in with the alt-right. It's also worth noting that Joseph Jr., Brigham, and Emma's appearances are all based on well-known artistic depictions of them. I'm going to show you another one. And I'm not sure if the text is too small to read. I don't have my glasses on. So in case that's you too, I'll be able to read the text for you. So this is another meme. The image is of Joseph Smith depicted as a saint in the style of the Eastern Orthodox iconography. And this meme of Joseph Smith was seen in a conversation on Twitter, a thread about Orthodoxy. And it's likely linked to the religion's popularity among the alt-right. So the text in the user, the person that is writing above that image, that icon, writes that the poster is going to found a non-heretical / schismatic, classically American ortho church with based American priests. And then someone responds to that with this image. And the text above that, if you can see it, is "Come home, brother." Right? We're not delving into these images deeply. This is just offered as a teaser into this data set. So this third image, again, feel free to think about and chat about what you see. This is a little bit of a different type of meme, one that's a little bit more of a contemporary phenomenon, evocative of the story of Samson and Delilah. This meme with caricatures of a woman whose shirt proclaims her to be a feminist and who is drawn in a way that's contrary to most depictions of traditional Mormon women: short hair, large earrings, and a half-naked man whose chest proclaims that he represents Brigham Young University. The woman smiles while holding a pair of scissors, and the once strong and virulent man has thrown his hands up in the air, his long locks of hair cut off in a pile next to him. And you can see in the hashtags above the image that this refers, and it's obviously in the hair too, that this refers to the BYU Honor Code. So these are three images that came up in our data set. We explored them and quite a few others in this paper on the screen. And we're offering that to you if you'd like to know more about a number of kind of themes that we've found going through this data set that we're not going to talk about tonight. So Spencer's going to link that article in the chat if you'd like to follow up and read more about kind of the alt-right and gendered issues that show up in this data set. Tonight, though, we're talking about religious authority. And in particular, we're talking about religious authority in online spaces and on DezNat's understanding and the use of religious authority. So tonight we're going to consider Campbell's question: what does religious authority look like in an age of digital media? And is it still held and defined by recognized religious leaders and the structures they work within? Previous research has demonstrated that Twitter allows Latter-day Saints to, quote, present Mormon identities and approach Mormon practice in ways other than those that are typically seen or approved of. That is, the internet creates a space outside of traditional Latter-day Saint authority structures and even lets Latter-day Saints challenge those authority structures. For example, it has been noted by other scholars that social media has long been a place where members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who had been marginalized gathered to safely talk about their faith lives and experiences. In recent years, some Mormons, and in particular the users of the DezNat hashtag, have used social media to react to and even to police those historically marginalized voices. So before we dive more deeply into how and what DezNat is doing, has been doing, I want to talk briefly about the data that we've been working with. Okay, so Ross mentioned this briefly, but just to reiterate that our observations, this data, are derived from an ongoing analysis of 1,378 tweets, so individual posts, that were composed in early April of 2019, and which contain the DezNat hashtag. So it's a label that gets put on a tweet, and that is searchable to us as researchers and to anyone else. While we are broadly familiar enough with the DezNat movement to know that this set of data is not an outlier of the hashtag, our talk is based on this subset of tweets particularly. And we chose these particular dates to capture this data because that was the weekend of General Conference, and this is an image of General Conference on the screen. So once we had these 1,378 tweets, we analyzed them using collaborative open coding, which means that we reviewed all of the data, all of the tweets, all of the images, all of the memes. We came up with a list of recurring topics, which we narrowed down to themes. And then Spencer and I worked together to decide what topics were present in which tweets. And if you happen to be kind of a research, data analysis methods nerd, feel free to ask questions because I am that way too. Throughout our analysis, we can how our assumptions, our biases, our interpretations of the data. Asked whether there were other explanations for the emerging themes that we fit, that each of us come to this data with different religious backgrounds.
Amy, I'm having trouble hearing you. You're fading. You're fading in and out. I don't know if that's...
Served in lay ministry in that tradition. Spence, please.
Spence, Amy, we're having trouble hearing you. I'm not sure if it's me or if I'm unstable or if you are. Can others hear Amy okay?
I think I'm having the same trouble, and we may have just lost her. Amy, are you still in?
Yeah, she was fading in and out. I guess you could hear it too then.
Okay.
Yeah, I was hearing the same problem.
Okay. She's trying to reconnect. I'll try and pick up. I won't do as good of a job as Amy is explaining this part, but Amy and I come from different religious backgrounds. Amy was raised Catholic and is a practicing Catholic. I have a deep familiarity with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this allowed us to play off of each other, and insider and outsider perspectives were both really important here. And then another thing that we kept in mind, and Amy, I see her back, welcome back, is that typically researchers who study people need to obtain consent from those people before they can study them. There is a large loophole carved out in American research policy for social media users, because so long as their activity is public, they are considered as sort of already consenting to this research. There are reasons for that, but that also puts us in an ethically tricky position, even though the folks we're studying in some ways are not very nice people. We still owe them something. And so in addition to trying to consider the biases that we might bring to these data, we also considered what we owe these people just as everyday human beings who are deserving of respect. So that's kind of just some background for how we came to the conclusions that we did. But as Amy pointed out, DezNat makes a lot of headlines because it draws on some of these themes of, the far right, white nationalism, aggressive anti-feminism, criticism of members of the LGBTQ community. And some of that's going to come up in what we talk about today. But we're going to leave, you all can read. We gave you the link to that paper. We'll give you that link to the paper again. We don't see much of a point in repeating what we've already written down. So what we'd like to talk about today is something that we think is often overlooked when people talk about this movement, if they have heard about the movement. And that's the way that folks in this DezNat movement try to reason through what authority looks like in the age of the internet. And to do that, we need sort of a vocabulary to do that. And we turned to a German sociologist named Max Weber. And he's somewhat famous for having come up with a tripartite, a three-part model of authority. He suggests there are three kinds of authority out there that people recognize. The first of these, and I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to try and explain how they connect to the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so that we can see why this model, why this vocabulary might be useful for understanding how DezNat tries to understand what does religious authority look like in the age of the internet. So the first of these is charismatic authority, and we often use the word charisma to refer to a force of personality, and that's certainly here. But Amy's the one with actual theological training. She'll have to catch me here, but my understanding is that charisma is actually also related to the word that in the New Testament often gets translated as something like spiritual gift. So it's not just a force of personality, it may also be some kind of spiritual authority as well. And Weber describes charismatic authority as coming from, the exceptional sanctity or heroic qualities or exemplary character of a person. And I think a charismatic authority neatly describes Joseph Smith Jr. In the early days of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He seemed to have just a force of personality that drew people to him, and he was able to claim interactions with angels and visitations from God. These were unique qualities that gave Joseph a particular authority. Weber also talks about a different kind of authority that he dubs legal authority. So a belief in the legality of statutory orders and the right of those appointed to exercise rule to give direction. So there's some sort of legal framework from which authority comes. And if we want to look at this in Latter-day Saint history, I think we can look at the days and months and years after Joseph Smith Jr. was killed. Not to say that Brigham Young and other people who were contending for the succession to Joseph did not have any kind of charisma. James Strang claimed visitations from angels. That's very much an appeal to charismatic authority. But Brigham Young, right, who was sort of the most successful of the claimants to be Joseph's successor, laid out a quasi-legal argument saying that in the absence of, right, the president of the church, it should go to the Quorum of 12 Apostles. And this was a little bit tricky because Joseph did not really lay this out in documentation. After Joseph's death, the reason that there was a succession crisis is because the legal standing of all these different claimants wasn't totally clear. But Brigham was able to make a pretty strong case that this is the way that things work, that there was some sort of quasi-legal framework in place, and that's the way that he claimed his authority after Joseph's death. And then there's this idea of traditional authority, that there are long-established traditions and that the legitimacy of those traditions gives legitimacy and authority to people and then gives it to the orders that they give. And so if Brigham Young laid out a kind of legal authority for his becoming the next leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in these days, it is a mix of legal and traditional authority that determines who the next prophet president of the church is going to be. And when Russell Nelson was set apart as president of the church, some of the language that the church used was, this is the way that it has always been done in Latter-day Saint history. And so there was an appeal to the kind of tradition here. We are not sociologists. We're not experts in Weber's work. But these three kinds of authority are helpful for us in trying to describe how DezNat itself, how this movement itself is trying to describe authority. And it's also helpful that there's actually a pretty strong connection between Weber and Mormonism. So Lowell Benyon, who's mentioned here in the title of this article, influential Latter-day Saint intellectual of the 20th century. He's actually the first person to have ever written about Max Weber and his views of authority in the English language. And Benyon and many others believed that Weber's ideas were actually really, really compelling for trying to describe how authority works in Latter-day Saint circles. So we'll refer a little bit to what Weber has to say. And we'll do so as we talk about what we found so far. So one of the things that we want to talk about first is that DezNat, so this movement, this Deseret Nation or Deseret Nationalism movement, pretty clearly claims some religious authority. And we're going to show you some posts here that we found as we were looking into this community that shows how they claim that authority. So this here is a post that we found where someone who is sympathetic to DezNat considers themselves a movement of the group, a member of the group, is trying to explain what the community stands for. And they explain DezNat as a group of folks interested in following the prophet and tired of seeing tweeted apostasy from members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints without any clarification, which is intended to lead away other members. So the way they see things is that you've got all of these lefty Mormons on the internet, or maybe ex-Mormons or anti-Mormons, who are trying to lead away other people. And DezNat wants to intervene because they're upset about that. So an example of this is one, particularly crass person who is criticizing the LGBTQ community for what this particular Twitter user perceives as trying to take over the church, take over conference, that sort of thing. And this kind of criticism is pretty common in what we see. And then some of you will no doubt be familiar with the Exponent, Mormon feminist periodical, and also in these days a blog, and has a social media presence. And here is someone in DezNat pointing to the Exponent and saying, this is what apostasy looks like. So they've pretty clearly lined up some enemies that they perceive on the internet. And the DezNat community sees itself in opposition to these enemies. Here we've got an image that gives a pretty clear indication of DezNat's self-conception. They are a roadblock warning away from danger. Or here they are a flag planted on the church for people to rally around. Okay, this is pretty interesting. This is not a quorum or a class or an officially organized group within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a group of people on the internet, but they are ascribing themselves some of this authority to be a flag, to be a barrier, to stand up against what they perceive as evil. And they actually go further than this. You may remember in the early months of President Russell Nelson's ministry as prophet president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he frequently gave, well, I guess not frequently, but several times over the early months of his ministry, he invited certain populations to take a social media fast, to step away from platforms like Twitter for some time. And during the April 2019 General Conference, there was some speculation. President Nelson had previously issued a social media fast to the youth of the church, and he had previously issued a social media fast challenge to the women of the church. So the only real population left was men. And there was some question at the priesthood session, there were priesthood sessions at the time, of the April 2019 General Conference, is President Nelson going to issue a challenge to the men to step back from social media? And when that didn't happen, because it did not happen, members of DezNat said, well, of course not, because the brethren know that the world needs DezNat more than ever. The prophet is not going to give a social media fast to the men of the church because the men of the church, or at least certain men of the church, are participating in DezNat. There's sort of this religious authority coming from the prophet to this group of people on Twitter. Here's another instance of this. This is an image in one of the tweets that we looked at. No social media fast this year. DezNat is needed right now. They assume that the leaders of the church know what they're doing and approve of what they're doing. Same here, all right? DezNat is needed to cry repentance to twitter.com. That's a fun little combination of scriptural language and a very, very modern social media site. Although, as Amy pointed out, even the modern social media site has changed its branding since then. Another example, the brethren need DezNat. The brethren are well versed in DezNat. So this idea that not only do the general authorities of the church approve of this group of people on Twitter, but they speak the same language. They are thinking in the same ways, and there's even this idea that the general authorities and general officers of the church are, right, what's the best way to put this? Ex officio members of the movement. They may not be tweeting using the hashtag, but this group of people on Twitter, right, who has not been called in any way, who has not been sustained or set apart in any way, they see themselves as in line with the leaders of the church, as though they are working together in this task. And here's another example of this sort of thing going on. To give you some background, what's happening here is someone in Mormon Twitter is raising concern about a particular talk during the April 2019 General Conference, saying, you know what, if such and such a general authority is going to give such and such a talk, that might give DezNat ideas. It might encourage them. And here's someone from the DezNat community saying, well, of course they're going to encourage us. The general authorities are DezNat. They're on our side, right? We belong together. We are working together. And that's interesting because, as Amy pointed out to us earlier, DezNat is frustrated with groups of people on the internet who are sort of laying claim in their perception to authority to say how things ought to be in the church. And yet, DezNat, in its own way, is doing that same thing, right? We may have a group of more liberally minded Latter-day Saints who are on Twitter saying things about feminism, expressing support for the LGBTQ community, and DezNat finds that out of line. And yet, DezNat hasn't been appointed to do anything else. In some ways, they are similar to these other groups that they are criticizing in that they are a group of people on the internet who have decided to share their religious opinions. And so to sort of resolve this conflict, we found that DezNat has to lay out a theory of religious authority. It has to justify how it gets the right to police other people on the internet. And to do that, let's show you how DezNat lays out this legalistic theory of religious authority. And you'll remember, right, Max Weber lays out three kinds of authority: charismatic authority, traditional authority, and then legalistic authority. DezNat opts for this latter one. But why not charismatic authority? This is worth asking about. DezNat is certainly open to the idea of charismatic authority, that there are people with particular gifts or that have a particular holiness or sanctity to them. And they actually attribute this to the general authorities of the church. So we have a statement here that wouldn't be out of, it wouldn't be out of place in a more mainstream Latter-day Saint context, right? I sat yards away from the Lord's chosen mouthpieces, attributing this special status to the general authorities of the church. So they're open to this charismatic authority, and they even have odd ways of expressing this opinion. This is Elder Neil Anderson. He gave a talk on the family, a proclamation to the world during the April 2019 General Conference. This was very well received by DezNat. And so DezNat did something that they do, and they gave Elder Anderson laser eyes, which is a way of them expressing spiritual power of some kind. We don't have time to get into all those interesting details. And then another interesting thing here, we have President Nelson down here, who's depicted as the Marvel villain Thanos. So the series of movies that over the past 15 years has been making waves. Many of these movies center around a villain, a purple-skinned villain, alien named Thanos. And for some reason, the DezNat community feels like it is actually a mark of great honor to depict their church leader as this, frankly, genocidal villain. We're not entirely sure about the logic there, but it seems to be some way of expressing that this man is special. And again, he's given the same sort of laser eyes. But DezNat is willing to give charismatic authority to the leaders of the church, but it does not assume that charismatic authority for itself. And I think part of the reason for that is because it understands that DezNat claiming some sort of angelic or divine or charismatic power would actually be a challenge to the general authorities of the church. And this right here is a brief blurb from a Salt Lake Tribune article featuring an interview with Denver Snuffer. Some of you may be familiar with that name. He's a charismatic figure who has called for more charismatic experiences within the church, and that eventually led to his excommunication because it was seen as challenging the general authorities. And so DezNat would not take that same step that Denver Snuffer has taken. This is not one of Weber's kinds of authority, but I want to talk quickly about algorithmic authority. This is the idea that the metrics and the numbers that are displayed on certain internet sites may confer a certain kind of authority. During the general conference, some DezNat members were very interested in how they were performing on Twitter as compared to other Latter-day Saint hashtags such as TwitterStake. So we've got this person right here saying, we trended higher than TwitterStake, we must be doing well. If we're succeeding on Twitter, that's proof of our authority, that's proof of our legitimacy. But they don't lean too heavily on that. So charismatic authority, they don't claim. Algorithmic authority, they play with. And then why not traditional authority? Well, frankly put, Twitter is not, it hasn't been around long enough to be able to lay claim to tradition. And so that leaves legal authority, more or less. So by legal authority, what I'm saying here, and I know that Ross is a lawyer, so he's going to find holes in like how legalistic they are being here, and we might have other lawyers here who do the same thing. But what I mean here is they lay out a sort of argument for how authority works in Latter-day Saint circles and how that authority gives them the right to tell other people what to do on social media. And unity is a major theme of this this legalish argument that they lay out. They argue that the general authorities are united when it comes to truth and doctrine. There are comments here trying to disabuse people of the idea that apostles might have different opinions about different church policies. As far as DezNat is concerned, they all agree with each other. And then the idea, I don't want to get too deep into the context here, but essentially one more liberally minded member of the church is saying, look at such and such a talk and pay attention to how it disagrees with this other talk during the same general conference. And to DezNat, that idea is entirely offensive. How can you think that this would be an attack? I'm not sure that's what the original account meant to say here, but unity, the unity of the general authorities is very important to DezNat, and we're going to see how that plays into their argument for authority later. But that unity isn't just, for DezNat, isn't just present amongst themselves, it's also a unity with God. So in one post that we looked at, we see this idea that the general authorities are united, they make their decisions unanimously with the confirmation of the Spirit. And I do want to point out that history provides a number of examples where Latter-day Saint general authorities viciously disagreed with each other. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification on the part of DezNat, but this is the theory that they are laying out. There's total unity, there's unity with the Spirit of God. And then here's the important part. DezNat sustains the brethren completely, and DezNat is united with the general authorities of the church. And this is in response to claims that DezNat is dividing members of the church. They're saying we're not dividing because we're on the same side with the general authorities, and the general authorities are on the same side with God. And this is how DezNat lays forth this claim to authority, this claim to sort of speak for the church on social media. It is the idea that God is united with the general authorities are united with each other. DezNat is united with each other. DezNat is united with the general authorities. Therefore, it goes straight down the line, right? No need for settings apart, no need for a special calling. There's that power of unity, and that unity gives DezNat authority. However, things are rarely so simple. We want to leave time for questions, so I might rush through this last part. We also see that even though DezNat lays out this argument for why they have authority, there are ways in which that gets challenged, and they kind of have to wrestle with it as they are interacting with fellow Latter-day Saints on Twitter during this general conference weekend. Now again, April 2019 is a pretty big general conference for a number of reasons. One of the reasons for this is because just before the general conference starts, the church announces that a 2015 policy restricting the baptism of children of parents in queer relationships. This policy had been announced in 2015. It was rolled back in 2019. And so you get some people on Twitter, this is not a DezNat person, it's someone else saying, well, if it was walked back in 2019, how can it be divine revelation in 2015? And this is causing a lot of conversation. And some people are asking in mock concern, oh, DezNat must be really having a hard time with this. Let's check up on them and make sure that they're doing okay. DezNat takes offense to this. And we see one example here. Here's someone saying, look, you know what? You all think that we're these right-wing crazies, but that's not really what this is about. If you think that we're upset about the church rolling back its previous policy, you don't get it. If you sustain the prophet, you sustain the prophet no matter what. So it's this idea of unity. And DezNat's defending itself from these accusations that they are just, far-right weirdos by saying, no, we just follow the prophet no matter what the prophet says. And so the same person on Twitter proceeds to give an example that they think is illustrative. So let's imagine that President Nelson gets up in conference and says that tacos are now against the word of wisdom. Some of us would be sad, yea, even saddened to tears, and I find that phrase pretty funny. But those who sustain the prophet as the mouthpiece of the Lord would simply give up tacos. We're going to do that. And this is interesting, right? Here's someone in DezNat laying out a hypothetical argument. I would be willing to follow the prophet no matter what, because that unity is important. It's how the authority comes. However, just a few hours earlier in the weekend, this same account was actually really uncomfortable with the idea of hypothetical arguments. So here, he is advancing a hypothetical argument. Even if the prophet said tacos are off the table, I would still sustain. But earlier in the weekend, someone is challenging him and saying, well, what if the prophet said that gay marriage is now okay? And this same person responds and says, look, hypothetical questions, these aren't appropriate. They are challenging faith. And so there's a discomfort with a certain kind of hypothetical, but a comfort with another kind of hypothetical. And to us, that speaks to some sort of crack in the theory of this argument. Maybe they aren't willing to sustain the prophet no matter what. Maybe there are actually limits to what they would do. And other people actually explicitly say this. You know, if church leaders announced that we would do same-sex sealings in the temple, my testimony would be destroyed. I know the church would never change its stance on marriage. And so these suggest, in contrast to some of the other things that DezNat says, that actually there are limits to the prophet's power. There are limits to what the president of the church can say and expect to be sustained. I think we'll skip this one for the purpose of time. But there's also some really interesting disputes about Spencer W. Kimball's famous book, The Miracle of Forgiveness. There's a group of folks within DezNat that are just trying to wrestle with, is this book authoritative just because it's written by a president of the church? And we have one person saying, well, Deseret Book doesn't sell the book anymore. Someone else says Deseret is still selling the book. And then a third person says, well, Deseret Book is selling books by Michelle Obama, so we can't trust what they do anyway, which is also a really interesting idea. Does Deseret Book inherit the church's authority, or can Deseret Book make mistakes? And then they're also wrestling with what is doctrine and what is not. I'd be happy to talk about those more in questions, but don't want to keep anyone up too late tonight. Quick.
You're fine. Don't worry about that. We're good
okay.
on time.
Glad to hear it. Let's wrap up a couple of things in conclusion here. So is the DezNat movement self-contradicting? We've suggested that they are, that they lay out this argument for why they can speak with an authoritative voice for the church in places like Twitter. But we want to give them some benefit of the doubt and do point out that social media is a rambunctious and wild place. It's a little bit ridiculous to expect that a loosely formed community that exists through these affinity ties on a place like social media is going to be connected with each other. And one DezNat member actually lays claim to that. They point out someone is criticizing the DezNat movement. Some people are talking about blood atonement in a kind of aggressive way. And so a critic of the DezNat movement says, well, you know, you got to keep your members in shape. And someone says, look, how do you make sure a hashtag is regulated? And that's a really good point. Social media movements are sort of amorphous. It's hard to put boundaries on them and that sort of thing. But at the same time, if DezNat is going to lay claim to this authority, then it needs to show a little bit of unity. And so there's more of this tension here. But one of the more interesting things, too, is this asking of how is religious authority defined in Latter-day Saint circles. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is somewhat famous for not having a systematic theology. There are a lot of authoritative documents that you can point to. But, you know, if you really dig in and ask where authority comes from, how authority is defined, you can always find rough edges. And that would be true of any movement, any religious movement in any church. But in the age of the internet, where it is possible for so many people, either to the left of the church or here to the right of the church, to speak out and talk in particular ways, it's good to ask the question, what does religious authority mean in Latter-day Saint circles? What are its limits? And are technologies like the internet starting to challenge folks' understanding of how this all works? And then another thing worth pointing out, Jenna Reese has written this 2019 book, so a few years old now, but I still think really important, talking about the rising generations in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And she points to many of these sort of culture war issues are tied up in authority. In this case, LGBT issues, but also women's issues and questions of race and everything else. There's it's hard to say. Well, we can't talk about any one of these issues and how it's being wrestled with in the church without also dealing with the question of authority, and that's something that's going to be interesting over the next few years. So rush through some of the slides there. We're really excited to take your questions, but just to kind of wrap things up with a bow, we are really interested in how this group is trying to wrestle with authority. They understand that things have changed, that Latter-day Saints can gather on the internet outside of the supervision of Latter-day Saint authorities and have conversations that they may not be able to have in a stake center or in a ward building. And because they recognize that, they are trying to adapt the Latter-day Saint model of authority to Twitter in a way that gives them the right to call other people onto the carpet and keep them in line. But even as they do that, they're wrestling with what it means and with consistency in their own ideas for what religious authority is. So that they recognize that things are changing. They're trying to make things not change so much, and yet they're still trying to they're having to deal with thinking some of these things through on their own. So thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point, but I'll be happy to share the slide deck with you all later, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you have at this point.
Well, we'll have a number of questions for you, but I wanted to give Amy a chance. I don't know, Amy, if you're able to participate, we'd love to have you chime in as well.
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now perfectly. Yes.
I'm not sure what happened before, but I'm back. And there is a question already in the chat. If that's where we want to start, not to take over.
Well, I was just going to ask you if you had anything you wanted to say in addition to what Spencer said before we turn to questions, but either way is fine.
I think the one thing that I would add as someone who is not a member of the LDS Church, I find these questions to be fascinating because I come from a church with a very different structure, theologically and hierarchically. There's a hierarchy in it that operates differently according to those different types of authority. And so a lot of the stuff that we study out of this data set is really hard to sit with. These questions just honestly fascinate me, how these people operate within a question of authority. So that's it. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you just a couple of preliminary questions before we go to the general chats. And the first question is, how active is DezNat these days? I just did a little background research, and Peggy Fletcher Stack, the Salt Lake Tribune columnist, notes that they're not very active anymore. And I think her point is that they've morphed a little bit, and they don't use the DezNat hashtag as much, but maybe the same people are participating in other different logos and hashtags.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's Amy said that some of this stuff is hard to spend time with and hold, and what that means that in practice is a little bit for our mental health. We took this snapshot in April 2019, but we have not embedded ourselves in this community. We are not embedded reporters in any sense of the word. And so we haven't followed every movement to and fro, but I would agree with Peggy's assessment that I think the forces are still there. I think many of the concerns are still there, but they don't necessarily go by this name anymore. And a number of years ago, there was actually an effort to reveal the identities of some of the people who were operating anonymous accounts on Twitter. One person who was then working as the Assistant Attorney General of Alaska was outed as someone who was making some of these comments, participating in some of these far-right conversations, and he actually lost his job. I'm not saying that was a bad thing, but it did spook a number of people. And I think there was a retreat by at least some members of the DezNat movement into smaller, more private spaces where maybe they could carp about communism in the church or whatever they wanted to complain about, but without the risk of putting themselves out there and getting some of the pushback. And so I don't think DezNat in 2023 looks the same way that it did in 2019, but I think some of the forces, I think some of the individuals, and I think some of the questions are still out there and still asking for attention.
Good. Second question I wanted to ask just concerns the fact that apparently, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but apparently the church has never come out and specifically says DezNat does not speak for us. And it sounds like, in one sense, of course, we're great believers in free agency and allowing people to speak as they wish. So in one sense, it's not surprising. On the other hand, we've had a recent event, as you're undoubtedly aware of, with this Tim Ballard situation here, where the church has come out very affirmatively and very strongly suggesting that it was inappropriate to use at least Elder Ballard's name and his endorsement in connection with Ballard's child rescue operations. I don't know if that represents a change in the church's approach to things like that, or that was just such a gross case that the church felt it couldn't stand still. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can chime in and then let Amy chime in if she has anything else to say. The church has made a comment in conversation with reporters from the Salt Lake Tribune, and then also to The Guardian. Amy was interviewed by someone at The Guardian. I'm still jealous about that, but I mean, she's fantastic, and so I think she deserves the credit. But you've got this British newspaper, and then you've got this Salt Lake Tribune, both of whom are interested in DezNat. The church releases the same statement to both. I think they're identical, essentially saying DezNat is not officially endorsed, and also, we abhor political violence. So I think that's good. It stops short of the condemnation of Tim Ballard. I think you're absolutely right there. It is similar in that the condemnation of Ballard, like DezNat, was delivered only to reporters who were specifically asking the church. It was not released as like a news statement or a PR statement of some kind through the church newsroom. And then another interesting thing is, although the church has semi-distanced itself from DezNat, it is not the full condemnation that Tim Ballard received, and it was specifically focused on political issues and political violence. In the paper that Amy and I wrote together, one thing that we point out is that DezNat also has very strong feelings about gender and sexuality. It is very anti-feminist, and it is critical of LGBTQ persons, especially those who claim to be faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and still embrace that LGBTQ identity. That the church, in its distancing itself from DezNat, has not made any comments about those aspects of the DezNat community. I think that's understandable for certain reasons, but it could leave some permission in some people's minds that it's still okay to go out there and criticize the feminists.
Amy, do you want to say anything further about that?
I just briefly, I think, so when we started analyzing this data, the church had not made such a statement. There was a long period of time in which we were engaging with this data where the church had said nothing at all. And so, again, perhaps a bit as an outsider, it felt like it took the church a while to come in and comment. And the ways, like Spencer said, the way in which the comment was made was very narrow against kind of a wide swath of issues that the users of the hashtag raise. And the, questions of religious authority are intellectually fascinating to me. Harassment of individual people is terrible, and it feels incongruent with any kind of religious tradition or spiritual experience. And so that kind of is striking to me. in its absence.
Good. First of all, Richard Hagelin asks, to what extent, if at all, is DezNat's concern about its authority different from what William James called the passion for certainty, which in some minds is insatiate in the varieties of religious experience? Richard, do you want to add anything further to that? Go ahead, Spencer.
Only that it seems to me that this is a very old conflict, and that it's something that certainly I've experienced numerous times, without talking about any details. I can say that I've lived long enough to go through several cycles of this in the church, and always there seems to be a real tension between people who seem to really feel a need for being able to see exactly where they are, and to see themselves somehow in opposition to those who are struggling to find a place of certainty in their own experiences. And I don't think we're significantly different from our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church in this regard, because my understanding is that there are similar challenges.
Yes.
There in that community.
Quite so. And I think I love your question, and I have two answers to it. The first is that as a researcher of 1,378 tweets, I can't say definitively that our data answers your question. As a person, as a believer, as a Catholic, this question has occurred to me. I think it would be fascinating if we could delve into it and answer it. And there have been times when I have had the hunch that that is behind some of what's happening here, but I can't prove it. That's my initial response to that. So I don't know if Spencer has more to say.
Richard, I feel like you're invoking Armand Mauss and some of his writings on how the church has gone back and forth with time. This isn't exactly the same thing, but Mauss says there are periods of time when the church really wants to set itself apart from the rest of the world, and there are other times where it releases those boundaries a little bit. And I think members of the church also go through those cycles as well.
I think that's right, that it's both an institutional and an individual challenge.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the situation not that long ago when the church came out with a very strong statement condemning violence, but nonetheless being very neutral as far as the Russia invasion into Ukraine. And of course, we saw virtually the same statement being made recently about the Hamas incursion into Israel. And it's easy to jump to the conclusion right away. Why don't they say what is obvious, which is this is an invasion, this is wrong, this is bloodshed and horror, which is beyond the bounds of decency? Why don't they do that? On the other hand, I'm reminded, I taught in the Ukraine for a while, and when I see those images of Ukraine, it just breaks my heart when I see those students that seem like they're standing up to tanks now that used to be sitting in the class and listening to me talk about legal ethics. But I'm bearing in mind also that we have members of the church in Russia that have a complete different political outlook and could be endangered by something that the brethren said that would be too harshly condemning of Russia. Now, that's unfortunately the case. And of course, I was a missionary in Germany, so I know a little bit about what it's like to stand to be a Latter-day Saint or a person of faith or determination in any one of the number of religious traditions in Nazi Germany. But, sometimes life is not as clear and clean as we'd like it to be. That was a question there someplace, but I'm not sure what it was, sir.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something that I thought about earlier. I was at a conference a number of years ago where someone made the comment, it's a shame that the word Mormon fundamentalist that phrase has been used to refer only to those who continue to practice polygamy in sort of these splinter groups, because fundamentalism is a force that members of the church and that the institutional church reckons with on a regular basis. And fundamentalism in that sense is that, as Richard has put it, things are clear, they are straightforward, there is no need to question anything. And, you know, there are Mormon fundamentalists who do not practice polygamy, who do not join these other offshoot groups, because they practice fundamentalism in these other ways, where they need things to be clear, they need things to be straightforward, everything has to be literally true.
They want to leave out the fear and trembling part.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Which makes it human. I mean, in some ways, right? So this data is so hard to sit with in some ways because people can be so cruel. And this data set really encapsulates some of the worst ways that humanity can express itself. But there are also fully human beings who are probably struggling with things too. And so I think your question, Richard, really helps me to say, well, what's going on with this person's life and this person's faith and the questions that are bubbling up for them, and for people certainly outside of within my tradition, but I've known people outside of my tradition too, having a container where if I operate within this box, all is well in my world and all is well with my hereafter, right? And that, to shake that psychologically, theologically, spiritually, that can make you fall apart. So there's an element to that here too that is not lost on me.
Absolutely.
Not lost on us.
Good. Gil Gould makes a point here, or asks a question. And if you can read it in the chat, I'll read it.
Mm-hmm.
I had always heard that the only the scriptures and the official proclamations of church, presumably the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is his point, were considered authoritative. In fact, I just looked at my Kindle copy of The Miracle of Forgiveness, and it mentioned that it contained this statement on the copyright page. This work is not an official publication of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The views expressed herein are the responsibility of the author and do not necessarily represent the position of the church or Deseret Book. Deseret Book is a registered trademark of Deseret Book Company. He's asking if you have any reaction to that statement. I guess
Gil,
directly.
is it Gil?
Gil, yes.
Okay. Gil, I think you have pointed out something really, really important here, but I am going to be rude and not actually answer the question, but rather say this question is actually at the heart of what we're trying to work with and what DezNat is trying to wrestle with. Because I think you're right, that statement there, The Miracle of Forgiveness is not an official publication of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and yet how many mission presidents and how many bishops and how many stake presidents have given it as an authoritative text to mostly young men, maybe some young women along the way, presuming that there is authority there. And, if it's only the scriptures and the official proclamations, where do general conference talks fit in there? Mm-hmm. Because general conference talks are held to be authoritative, are held to be like unto scripture, but there's also a recognition that they may stop short in some ways. And so even the institutional church, I think, has trouble putting boundaries on this. And this isn't a criticism. I think it's a natural part of humans trying to figure out something like a church, something like encounters with the divine. But what DezNat is trying to figure out here is even, right, if the family, a proclamation to the world, has not been canonized as scripture, does that make it less than scripture? And that's a valid question. I don't think it's our point to say one way or the other. Our point is to call attention to these wrestlings that are happening within DezNat, and I think happen in Sunday school classes and in wards and in families all over the church, trying to figure out what really is authoritative and what really is not. And the church does not always come out and say so, because I think it, at an institutional level, is also trying to wrestle with this.
Good. A fellow with an interesting last name, Saul Harris Boundy, asks, respecting that you did not embed yourself as journalist in the DezNat community, he wonders if the movement reacted at all to your research in your subsequent paper.
Amy, did any sneak through to you? I can't remember.
A few.
Okay.
So the answer is yes, they reacted. before anything was put out publicly, and the first things that got put out were not published papers, but conference presentations. We talked, Spencer and I, about if people from the community were going to react and how we might kind of protect ourselves and what kind of level of engagement we wanted to have. I chose to not interact with the community for my own mental health and safety. And so I proactively blocked a lot of the users on Twitter. If anyone had actually wanted to meaningfully engage with me to question the science behind our work or I totally would have been up for that. It's not what happened because Spencer didn't block them. He wanted to capture the reactions that people had. A few of them did get through to me, and I'm glad that I did put up those blockers because the ones that came through were crass and vulgar and awful. Also, somebody wrote a song about us and posted that online. And that's got to be my professional peak right there. That's wrote a song about our work.
I don't mean to be laughing.
No, you have to laugh. You have to laugh, or you don't get through the day about this stuff. Truly, but so I really didn't see a lot of it. I haven't seen a lot of it. So Spencer, maybe you can talk about your experience of it.
I think we got told we were going to hell once. I was going to bring up the song. That was wild. A few folks told us that we were wasting our time, that we were doing ridiculous research, and that we weren't tracing anything down. In the grand scheme of things, it wasn't awful, but it certainly wasn't pleasant experiences either. So we've had a few interactions back and forth, but nothing sustained.
Well, if they were my people, I would apologize, but I'm not quite willing to go that far yet.
No, that's perfectly all right.
I wanted to ask another question about memes and the likes, and I'm no expert here. I'm one of the old school guys here, but I got a kick out of the flag that was going down the river on the raft or log or whatever it was, and I wondered if that flag had any significance. And along with it, I wanted to ask about the laser eyes. I'd never heard that one before. And those are obviously something that I guess are well known to DezNat users apparently.
It's popped up in a couple of other places as well. Amy, I don't know that the flag has any other significance than a more straightforward visual metaphor.
Not that I know of.
Okay. Laser eyes, we did, surprisingly, you can do a little bit of research on memes, and so we hit up a couple of websites trying to see if they could clue us in on some things. Laser eyes seem to be an indication of some kind of great power. It's not exclusively limited to folks who are on the far right, but there is a sense of right-wing power with that. When Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court, her image was put, some folks added laser eyes to an official portrait of her and spread that around a couple of times. We managed to track that down. But it just seems to be, internet culture is fascinating. It's not high culture, but it has its own meanings. And Ross, do you mind if I show one of these memes again?
No, not at all, please.
Okay. Where? Okay. This one right here, there are deliberate typos in here. It's the art is intentionally crude, and not like in a moral sense, but just like no one put a lot of effort into this. YOU is spelled for you here, and it's fascinating. Other internet researchers do work on this. They call it, and I will censor this a little bit here, but an intentionally crappy aesthetic. And so, like, this image right here is pulling from internet expectations about what jokes look like. At the same time, it's referencing official or semi-official Latter-day Saint art. At the same time, it's referencing a frog image that is used in white nationalist circles for reasons that are far too complicated to get into. And in here, right, is also an implicit critique of another Restoration church. There's so much packed in here. that that doesn't quite answer your question, Ross. I think it just raises more questions to be asked. But there's a lot going on here. That these are folks that understand internet culture as well as Latter-day Saint culture, and they know how to take cues from scary groups like Online White Nationalists.
I'm curious also by Amy's comment about crude and I guess you said obscene comments, etc. What about violence? Did you? I mean, is violence a part at all of those who sometimes use the DezNat logo?
Yes. In the sense that they speak about it, and they speak about it in a positive sense, not in a sense of we've done further searching where people have actually committed acts of violence. I've seen no evidence that that is true. But there are, or we would have talked about that had that come up. But in the tweets, there is a presence of people who are either very comfortable with or actively advocating for violence under certain circumstances. I see you wanting to say something, Spencer.
I'm trying to pull up an example.
Thank you. So there are, I would say there's kind of 2 or 3 ways in which that manifests itself. One is that there's a subset of people who are very aggressive towards women specifically, that women who are speaking out or who are not conforming to what they think a woman should look like, act like, sound like, should be hurt or assaulted. There are people who use kind of historical, and Spencer needs to speak about this because my Mormon history is very rusty. He did a really good job teaching me. I read a lot about it, but it's not something that I've talked about recently. But there's a thread of kind of violence that appears in Mormon history, and then there are people who just
joking about blood atonement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And knives.
Brigham Young made a comment in the Journal of Discourses, or at least in one of his sermons that made it into the Journal of Discourses, about the importance of having a Bowie knife to slay apostates, and that is something that made it into DezNat rhetoric. Again, like Amy said, there's no indication that anyone has actually acted on these threats, but there's a comfort level with violent language that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. David Lurcher asks a very poignant question: is what's ahead for your research? Would you have any plans to revisit the topic or related topics in the future?
Well, we're going to write a paper about this. We have some more thinking to do about religious authority and what we really want to say. It helps to have conversations with good, smart people who ask us questions, to keep thinking it through. What else do you want to say about the future of our research? I'm really the sidekick in this, I assure you.
The work couldn't have been done without Amy. But I'm working on a couple of projects that I felt like I had dragged Amy through enough, and so I spared her from these partnerships. I'm actually next week going to be at a conference in Salt Lake presenting on Latter-day Saints or Latter-day Saint groups on the social media platform known as Gab. Gab brands itself as a sort of free speech platform, but really it's a place where far-right folks can hang out. The 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue shooter posted his manifesto to Gab before going out and committing that terrible act. And so it's a place where conspiracy theorists are comfortable, where election fraud conspiracists are comfortable, where it's appropriate to say it's people on this platform feel that it's appropriate to make even worse comments about gay people and women than we've documented here in DezNat. But there are Latter-day Saint groups on this website. They aren't particularly scandalous. That kind of surprised me. They act just kind of like a Facebook group, but there's still something interesting in the fact that there are Latter-day Saints who feel like that's a perfectly normal place to be a Mormon. So I'm trying to dig into that a little bit.
Interesting. I'm prompted to say one other thing about Gil Gould's question about Spencer W. Kimball's book. And I stand could be corrected here. If somebody wants to correct me, please feel free to do so. But I believe in Spencer W. Kimball's biography, he says he regrets some of the things that he said in that Miracle of Forgiveness. Or maybe put it a little softer. I think he said if he had it to say again, he would have said it in a softer, different way than he did at that time. Which I think just underscores again the conundrum that we all face when we're trying to decide what's authoritative and what isn't. You know, Latter-day Saints, on one hand, I suppose, can be thought of as being one of the most open in terms of our belief in individual revelation, which is signal, I think, and significant in terms of our doctrine goes.
I was at a meeting where President Monson spoke over the pulpit and quoted a little story he'd had with President Kimball, in which he said President Kimball told him when he was just a general authority that he was sorry he ever wrote that book. That was right out of President Monson's mouth. So,
yeah, thanks. So some pretty good authority there. Anyone else want to ask any questions or make any comments before we close what's been a fascinating evening? Don't want to foreclose anybody from speaking. Well, let me just tell you for just a quick minute where we're going to go here in just a minute. I'm going to ask my grandson, Saul Harris Boundy, if he would give us a benediction tonight. That sounds like fair play, don't you think? Next week, we're going to hear another presentation from Matt Martinich. Matt spoke to us last June, and he has some remarkable things to say. He's not, I would say at the outset, he's not an official statistician with the church by any means. In fact, he has a doctorate degree in psychology, and he specializes in clinical neuropsychology. So he's a real scientist, but he's a fascinating guy who really understands statistics and has really gotten into the church to statistics in a way that few people have done. One of the interesting things about it is, of course, Latter-day Saints are always interested in watching President Nelson at each conference to see what temples he's going to announce. And Matt has the distinction of, I think, predicting with uncanny accuracy in terms of which temples are likely to be announced by simply looking at the statistics showing where temple populations go. So he's going to speak to us again next week, October the 21st. He talked to us again, gave us some fascinating insights into where the church is headed, whether the church is losing or gaining ground, and where the gains are taking place. So I encourage you all to attend that. He's a very interesting guy, very animated speaker, and we're delighted to have him back again. Thanks to all of you for participating tonight. Spencer and Amy, Godspeed. Really appreciate your performance, your presentations tonight. I think been very helpful, and we really appreciate it. So
It's been a real honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful this evening for the time that Spencer and Amy took to share their labors of love with us, their research. We're thankful for the spirit that we all felt as we learned about studies and other ways we can understand our own leadership and our own members. We're grateful, Father, for the gift of intellect and of agency, and we pray that we might be able to continue to live with a strong gift of discernment to decide how we use that agency. We love thee very much and say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. I want to wish you all a good Sabbath tomorrow. And again, thanks to our guests tonight. Good night.